Fort Benning, Georgia. Winter, 1943. While German and Italian prisoners of war sat at tables in the post exchange, drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes, First Sergeant Walter Morris stood outside in his United States Army uniform, forbidden to enter. The men he commanded couldn't use the movie theater, couldn't enter the officers' club, couldn't access the same facilities as enemy soldiers they'd captured. Morris watched white paratroopers train for combat jumps into Nazi-occupied Europe, while his service company guarded the parachute school at night, relegated to the shadows, expected to fail. What happened next would create the most elite unit the Army refused to use. The parachute school at Fort Benning represented everything the segregated Army believed black soldiers couldn't do. Airborne operations demanded intelligence, physical conditioning, split-second decision-making, and absolute courage. The prevailing military doctrine held that black soldiers lacked all of these qualities. They could cook, clean, haul supplies, and guard equipment, but jump out of perfectly good airplanes behind enemy lines? The idea was dismissed as not just impractical, but dangerous. Walter Morris refused to accept this verdict. As first sergeant of the all-black service company assigned to support the parachute school, he faced a morale crisis among his men. They watched white soldiers their own age preparing for glory, while they swept floors and checked fences from 4 in the afternoon until 8 the next morning. The segregation cut deeper than professional disappointment. Morris later recalled the psychological damage. When we walked past the post exchange, we could see the German and Italian prisoners sitting at tables drinking and smoking, and we, in the same uniforms, could not go in, so it is understandable how colored soldiers would have an inferiority complex. Morris developed a plan born of defiance and tactical brilliance. His men were confined to the training areas during off hours when white paratroopers had left. Rather than waste those hours, Morris began running his company through the same grueling obstacle courses the airborne students faced. 5-mile runs in full gear, tower climbs, parachute landing falls. His men attacked the training with desperate intensity, knowing they were proving something the Army didn't want proven. They trained in secret for weeks, pushing themselves beyond the standard set for white paratroopers. Then one afternoon in early 1943, Lieutenant General Ridgely Gaither, commandant of the parachute school, happened to observe the service company running the obstacle course. Gaither was a Southern officer with a reputation for being tough as nails and just as straight. What he saw that day challenged every assumption he'd been taught about race and capability. Gaither summoned Morris to his office. The young sergeant expected disciplinary action for using training facilities without authorization. Instead, Gaither revealed something extraordinary. President Franklin Roosevelt, under pressure from his Negro Advisory Committee and facing criticism for the military's racial policies, had ordered the formation of an all-black paratrooper unit. The Army had been dragging its feet. Certain such a unit would fail. Gaither had just watched Morris's men prove otherwise. "I need a first sergeant for this new unit," Gaither told Morris. "Based on what I've seen, you're the man for the job." The 555th Parachute Infantry Company was officially constituted on February 25, 1943, and activated on December 30, 1943. The test platoon began with 20 volunteers, 17 of them coming from the 92nd Infantry Division, the historic Buffalo Soldiers. The nickname Triple Nickles emerged from this heritage. The numerical designation 555 combined with the 3 Buffalo Nickels from the 92nd Division's insignia, deliberately spelled with the Old English form to mark their distinctiveness. Morris and his men entered parachute training, knowing the entire post had bet against them. White soldiers wagered that the black trainees would refuse to jump, that fear would overcome them at the aircraft door. The skepticism went beyond simple racism. It was institutional doctrine. The entire segregated military system was built on the assumption that black soldiers couldn't perform at the level required for elite units. On February 8, 1944, Morris and 16 others graduated from parachute school. They pinned on their silver jump wings in a moment of quiet triumph. They had become the first black paratroopers in United States Army history. The bets were lost. The doctrine was wrong, but the resistance had only just begun. Word spread through the black enlisted ranks that the Army had opened parachute training. Men from across the service clamored to join. The test platoon expanded to a company, then to a full battalion. By November 25, 1944, when the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion was officially activated at Camp Mackall, North Carolina, it had grown to over 200 men. Unlike other black units officered by white commanders, the 555th was entirely black from commanding officer to newest private. 6 black officers had completed jump school alongside the enlisted men, another unprecedented achievement. The Triple Nickles trained with intensity that bordered on obsession. They understood they weren't just preparing for war, they were fighting for recognition. Every formation had to be perfect. Every jump had to be textbook. Every physical test had to be exceeded. They couldn't afford to be as good as white paratroopers. They had to be better. By late 1944, the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion was combat-ready and alerted for deployment to Europe. The Allied airborne forces had suffered catastrophic losses in Operation Market Garden in September. The Battle of Normandy had decimated parachute regiments. The Army desperately needed trained airborne replacements. Then came December 16, 1944. German forces launched a massive counterattack through the Ardennes forest, beginning the Battle of the Bulge. American airborne units bore the brunt of the assault. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions fought surrounded at Bastogne and Saint-Vith, taking horrific casualties. The need for airborne reinforcements became critical. The 555th waited for orders that never came. Behind closed doors in the European theater headquarters, commanders made their decision. They didn't question the Triple Nickles' training or capability. The objection was simpler and more damning. As one officer stated in a report later recovered, "We don't want to add more black troops to this effort because we don't want to deal with racism and fight a war at the same time." European field commanders feared the social disruption of integrating black paratroopers with white units. They worried about fights between soldiers, about Southern white troops refusing to serve alongside black soldiers, about the complications of maintaining segregation in forward combat zones. Rather than challenge the racism, they denied the 555th their chance at combat. Walter Morris later summarized the betrayal with bitter clarity. No field commander in Europe or the Far East wanted colored troops mixing with their racist white troops. The Army was stuck with us. The battalion remained at Camp Mackall through the winter of 1944 and into spring 1945, watching the war in Europe wind toward victory without them. German forces crumbled. Allied armies crossed the Rhine. VE Day approached. The Triple Nickles had trained for this moment, had proved themselves worthy of it, and had been denied solely because of the color of their skin. Then, in early May 1945, secret orders arrived. The 555th was being deployed, not to Europe, not to the Pacific Theater they hoped for, but to Pendleton, Oregon. The orders were classified under the designation Operation Firefly. The men packed their gear, assuming this was a brief stopover before shipping out to join General Douglas MacArthur's forces in the Pacific. On May 5, 1945, the same day the 555th received their movement orders, a minister's wife and 5 children were killed near Bly, Oregon. Elsie Mitchell, 5 months pregnant, had taken her Sunday school class on a picnic in the Gearhart Mountain area of the Fremont National Forest. While Reverend Archie Mitchell unloaded picnic baskets from the car, his wife and the children explored a nearby creek bed. They found a large white object partially deflated in the underbrush. As the children gathered around to examine it, the device exploded. The blast killed all 6 instantly. They became the only people killed by enemy action on the continental United States during World War II. What killed them was a Fugo balloon bomb, part of a desperate Japanese weapon program that had been operating in secret for months. Between November 1944 and April 1945, Japan launched approximately 9/10 of these weapons from sites along the eastern coast of Honshu Island. Each balloon was 33 feet in diameter, constructed of tissue paper made from mulberry wood and stitched together by conscripted schoolgirls. Filled with hydrogen and carried by the jet stream, the balloons traveled 6,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean in roughly 3 days. Each Fugo carried a payload of incendiary devices and one 15-kilogram high-explosive bomb designed to drop over North America and ignite massive forest fires. The Japanese hoped to create panic, divert military resources, and damage the timber industry critical to American war production. By the time the 555th received their orders, about 300 balloon bombs had been confirmed in locations from Alaska to Michigan, with most landing in the Pacific Northwest. The American response combined military mobilization with strict censorship. The Office of Censorship requested that newspapers and radio stations make no mention of the balloon bombs, preventing the Japanese from learning whether their weapons were reaching their targets. Operation Firefly was established to combat the threat, coordinating military assets with the United States Forest Service. The 555th arrived at Pendleton Field not knowing their actual mission. Walter Morris, by then a second lieutenant, later recalled the moment of realization. He left the train to buy cigarettes and encountered a group of loggers sitting around a pot-bellied stove. "Oh, you're here," they said. "We've been waiting for you a long time. We read in the paper that you were coming out here to be smoke jumpers." The disappointment was crushing. These men had trained as elite combat paratroopers, had prepared to fight the most powerful military forces in history, and instead they were being assigned to fight forest fires. But orders were orders, and the threat was real. Intelligence analysts worried that the Japanese might escalate from incendiaries to chemical or biological weapons. Project Lightning had stockpiled decontamination chemicals across western states in preparation for this possibility. 200 enlisted men of the 555th reported to Pendleton, with an additional detachment of 100 sent to Chico, California. The Forest Service began immediate retraining. Standard parachute training taught soldiers to avoid trees at all costs. Tree landings could impale jumpers or leave them hanging helplessly. Smoke jumping required the opposite approach. In the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, clear landing zones didn't exist. Jumpers had to land deliberately in trees, some towering 200 feet high, then rope down to the ground. The equipment reflected this unique mission. Steel helmets were replaced with football helmets fitted with wire mesh face protectors. Each jumper carried 50 feet of nylon rope for the letdown from tree landings. They wore heavy padding and carried firefighting equipment instead of rifles and ammunition. The training program covered fire behavior, fire line construction, bomb disposal procedures, and survival in remote wilderness areas. The 555th faced hostility from the first day. The Pendleton Air Base commander made clear his displeasure at hosting an all-black unit. Umatilla County was heavily influenced by the Ku Klux Klan, and segregation was enforced throughout the region. Only 2 bars and 1 Chinese restaurant in Pendleton would serve the black paratroopers. When dispatched to distant fires, they struggled to find lodging. They spent most of their time confined to base, training and waiting for fire calls. Despite the discrimination, the Triple Nickles mastered smoke jumping with characteristic excellence. The Forest Service trainers found them disciplined, intelligent, and fearless. They attacked the mission with the same intensity they'd brought to combat training. If the Army had denied them the war they trained for, they would excel at the war they'd been given. The first fire call came on July 14, 1945, to the Klamath National Forest. A detachment from Chico responded, making their first operational jumps into burning timber. The reality of the mission became immediately clear. This wasn't symbolic duty or make-work designed to keep them out of combat. Jumping into forest fires required every bit of skill and courage they possessed. The fires burned in remote mountain terrain, accessible only by air. Jumpers landed in dense forest, sometimes dangling from trees in choking smoke, while flames advanced below them. After completing the letdown, they fought fires for days at a time with only the equipment they'd jumped in with, clearing fire lines with hand tools until Forest Service mule trains could reach them with reinforcements. Then they hiked out, sometimes walking 15 miles or more through mountainous wilderness, and prepared for the next jump. Through the summer of 1945, the Triple Nickles made over 1,200 individual jumps. They fought fires across Oregon, California, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and into Canada. The statistics don't capture the danger. trees that snapped in the fire and fell without warning, smoke so thick it obscured the ground during landings, flames that shifted direction with sudden winds, threatening to trap jumpers in burning timber, equipment failures that left men dangling from insufficient rope lengths. Each jump carried lethal risk. They also located and disarmed balloon bombs. The Forest Service couldn't always determine whether a fire had started from lightning, careless campers, or Japanese incendiaries. When the 555th jumped on a fire, they searched the area for bomb remnants. The paratroopers, trained in explosives, became expert at identifying and safely destroying the devices. Intelligence officers collected the remains to analyze Japanese capabilities and production methods. The triple volunteer, airborne, medic, and operational replacement came on August 6, 1945. Private First Class Malvin L. Brown, a 24-year-old medic from Baltimore, Maryland, had arrived at Pendleton later than most of the battalion because he was completing medical training. The 555th maintained medical personnel on every mission, and their presence had proved essential as the battalion sustained over 30 injuries during fire operations. On the morning of August 6th, 15 military smoke jumpers were requested for a fire near Lemon Butte in the Umpqua National Forest. The assigned medic was sick. Brown volunteered to take his place despite not having completed his smoke jumper training. The fire was located on a ridge where many trees exceeded 200 feet in height. The jump spot measured approximately 2 acres, surrounded by towering firs. Brown exited the C-47 in a stick of 9 jumpers. His parachute caught in one of the massive trees. At approximately 5 in the afternoon, Brown began his letdown, descending the rope hand over hand toward the ground 140 feet below. Something went wrong. Whether the rope slipped through his hands, whether equipment failed, whether smoke inhalation affected his grip, the reports don't say. Brown fell. He struck rocks at the base of the tree and died instantly. He became the first smoke jumper to die in the line of duty, the only member of the 555th to die during World War II. His fellow paratroopers carried his body out through 15 miles of wilderness over 2 days, reaching a road at 7 in the morning on August 8th. Malvin Brown died the same day the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The local newspaper in Roseburg, Oregon, ran both stories on the front page. The nuclear weapon that would end the war received headlines. The death of a black paratrooper fighting a forest fire was barely mentioned and quickly forgotten. His body was shipped back to Pennsylvania and turned over to his widow, Edna, whom he'd married after entering the army. She buried him in a cemetery south of Baltimore. His grave went unmarked by the army and forgotten by history until researchers located it 70 years later. The tragedy underscored the fundamental injustice of the 555th's assignment. Malvin Brown was trained to jump into occupied France or the Philippines to fight with rifles and grenades against enemy soldiers. Instead, he died fighting a forest fire because army commanders in Europe had decided that dealing with racism was more inconvenient than denying black soldiers their chance at combat. The balloon bomb threat largely ended before Brown's death. Japan launched the last Fugo on April 20, 1945, having exhausted their supplies of hydrogen and paper. The lack of news coverage convinced Japanese commanders that the program had failed. In reality, about 300 balloons had reached North America, but the press blackout prevented the Japanese from learning this. The Fugo program was terminated, and the expected massive forest fire campaign never materialized. Yet the 555th continued their mission through the summer and fall of 1945. They responded to 36 fire calls total, making jumps that had nothing to do with Japanese weapons. They fought fires started by lightning, by careless campers, by natural causes in one of the driest fire seasons on record. The Army kept them in Oregon, not because the balloon bomb threat demanded it, but because no one knew what else to do with 200 elite black paratroopers. In October 1945, the 555th returned to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. A prejudiced garrison commander assigned them the worst housing on post, continuing the pattern of discrimination that had defined their service. The men who had proved their excellence in training, who had mastered a dangerous mission under hostile conditions, who had served their country with distinction, were still treated as second-class soldiers, but something had changed at Fort Bragg. Major General James Gavin, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, had been watching the Triple Nickles. Gavin was a combat veteran who had jumped with his men on D-Day and into Holland during Market Garden. He believed in merit over prejudice, in proven capability over institutional racism. The 555th's performance in Oregon had impressed him. More importantly, they represented the future he envisioned for the Army. On December 15, 1947, Gavin called the 555th to formation. When their commander presented the battalion, Gavin made an announcement that stunned everyone present. The 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion was being integrated into the 82nd Airborne Division as the 3rd Battalion, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The Triple Nickles colors were being retired. The distinctive unit was being dissolved. But in its place, the 82nd Airborne Division was becoming the first integrated division in the United States Army. Walter Morris later recalled that day, "Everybody was crying. I think we were crying for two different reasons. We were glad that segregation was leaving the Army, and we were sad we were losing our triple nickel colors. The integration wasn't symbolic. Black soldiers and white soldiers moved into the same barracks. They trained together, jumped together, served together." Morris emphasized what happened next. There was not one incident of racism, not one. The reason was simple. The white paratroopers of the 82nd had watched the Triple Nickles prove themselves. They'd heard about the mission in Oregon, about the dangerous jumps into burning forests, about the professionalism under discrimination. The 555th veterans earned leadership positions throughout the division based on merit. They weren't accepted because of orders or good intentions. They were accepted because they were excellent soldiers, and excellence transcended prejudice. 7 months later, on July 26, 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating desegregation of the United States Armed Forces. The 82nd Airborne Division, thanks to the Triple Nickles, was already there. They'd beaten the executive order by half a year, proving that integration could work if leaders had the courage to implement it. The legacy of the 555th extended far beyond their formal dissolution. When the unit was officially disbanded on August 22, 1950, many former Triple Nickles volunteered to form the 2nd Airborne Ranger Company. This all-black Ranger unit deployed to Korea and made a combat jump at Munsan-ni on March 25, 1951, the first combat jump ever made by a United States Army Ranger unit and the only combat jump ever made by an all-black unit. Other 555th veterans served in the 82nd Airborne, the 101st Airborne, the 11th Airborne Division, the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team, and Special Forces. The Triple Nickles served in more airborne units, in both peace and war, than any other parachute group in American history. The men who had been denied combat in World War II helped win the Korean War and laid the foundation for the integrated military that would fight every American conflict since. The injustice of their World War II service remains stark. The 505th Parachute Infantry Battalion represented everything the Army claimed to want. Elite soldiers, superbly trained, disciplined, and eager for combat. They were ready to jump into Normandy, into Holland, into Germany itself. They could have reinforced the battered airborne units at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. They could have participated in the crossing of the Rhine or the final assault into the German heartland. Instead, they fought forest fires in Oregon because European theater commanders explicitly stated they didn't want to deal with integrating black troops. The decision wasn't based on military necessity or tactical considerations. It was based purely on racism and administrative convenience. The Army chose prejudice over combat effectiveness, social comfort over battlefield success. Consider what was lost. The 505th never got to prove in combat what they'd demonstrated in training, that black soldiers could perform at the highest level of military operations. They never earned the combat decorations their white counterparts received. They never got the glory of liberating concentration camps or accepting German surrenders. History books tell the story of the 82nd and 101st Airborne, of heroic jumps and desperate stands, but the Triple Nickles appear only in footnotes, if they appear at all. Walter Morris and his men lived with this denial for the rest of their lives. They'd volunteered for the most dangerous duty the Army offered. They'd met every standard and exceeded every expectation. They'd mastered a mission so dangerous it killed one of their own. And when the war ended, when veterans came home to parades and benefits and recognition, the Triple Nickles returned to segregated housing and continued discrimination. The cruelty wasn't just in the denial, it was in the timing. By May 1945, when the 555th shipped to Oregon, German forces were collapsing. The war in Europe would end on May 8th, just 3 days after the unit arrived in Pendleton. If the Army had deployed them in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the Triple Nickles could have seen months of combat. Instead, they were kept waiting until combat was nearly over, then sent to fight fires. The pattern repeated the systemic injustice that defined black service in World War II. Black soldiers who volunteered for combat were assigned to service units. Black pilots who qualified for fighters were held back from deployment. Black officers who earned commands were passed over for white officers with less experience. At every level, institutional racism ensured that black soldiers couldn't prove their capability in the arena that mattered most: combat. The 555th broke through some of these barriers. They became elite paratroopers. They earned their jump wings. They proved they could master complex missions under dangerous conditions. But the ultimate barrier, deployment to combat, remained insurmountable, not because they weren't ready, but because white commanders weren't ready to accept them. The men of the Triple Nickles never expressed bitterness in their later interviews, at least not publicly. They took pride in their service, in their pioneering role in smoke jumping, in their contributions to integration. Walter Morris spoke of the honor of serving, of the privilege of wearing jump wings, of the satisfaction of proving doubters wrong, but the loss remains. These men volunteered to fight the most evil regime in human history. They trained to liberate Europe from fascism. They prepared to risk everything for their country. And their country told them they weren't good enough, weren't acceptable, weren't wanted. The real reason that white commanders prioritized racial comfort over military effectiveness was never officially acknowledged. The Triple Nickles deserved better. They deserved the chance to jump into Normandy alongside the 82nd Airborne. They deserved to fight in the Battle of the Bulge, when airborne reinforcements were desperately needed. They deserved combat decorations earned in battle, not just training commendations earned at home. They deserved to be remembered as combat veterans, not as a footnote about smoke jumpers. Malvin Brown deserved to die fighting the enemy he'd trained to fight, not falling from a tree on a forest fire. His widow deserved the recognition due to a combat casualty, not a training accident. His name deserved to be listed among the honored dead of World War II, remembered as a paratrooper who gave his life in service, not forgotten in an unmarked grave for 70 years. The 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion proved something the Army refused to acknowledge, that black soldiers could perform at the highest level of military operations. They didn't prove it in combat because they were never given the chance. They proved it in every other way possible. And when the Army finally allowed integration, the Triple Nickles made it work. Their service exposes the lie at the heart of segregation. The Army didn't separate black and white soldiers because black soldiers were inferior. They did it because accepting black soldiers as equals would have required confronting the racism that permeated American society. It was easier to deny the 555th their combat deployment than to challenge white commanders' prejudices. But you can't suppress excellence forever. The Triple Nickles forced the Army to recognize black soldiers' capability. They became smoke jumpers and proved they could master any mission. They integrated the 82nd Airborne and proved that black and white soldiers could serve together. They served in Korea and proved they could fight and die alongside any American unit. The generation that followed never had to fight these battles because the Triple Nickles fought them first. Every black soldier who serves in today's integrated military owes a debt to the men who wore the 3 buffalo nickels. Every paratrooper who pins on jump wings follows in the footsteps Walter Morris and his men blazed. Every service member who serves in a truly merit-based military benefits from the proof the 555th provided. History remembers the injustices, but tends to forget the men who suffered them. The Triple Nickles deserve more than remembrance. They deserve recognition as the elite soldiers they were, as the pioneers who broke barriers, as the men who proved that courage and capability have no color. They jumped out of perfectly good airplanes into burning forests, risking their lives on every mission, all while facing discrimination from the country they served. The Army refused to send them to World War II because dealing with racism was too inconvenient. So the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion fought a different war, against prejudice, against low expectations, against a system designed to ensure their failure. They won that war, and in winning it, they helped create the integrated military that would go on to win every war that followed. The Triple Nickles, 3 buffalo nickels joined in a triangle, representing 3 fives and the buffalo soldiers who came before. They were America's first black paratroopers. They were denied the combat they trained for. They became smokejumpers and bomb disposal experts instead. They integrated the 82nd Airborne Division before integration was ordered. They served in more airborne units than any other parachute group in history. And they proved beyond any possible doubt that the Army's reasons for denying them combat had nothing to do with capability and everything to do with cowardice, not the soldiers' cowardice, but the cowardice of commanders who chose prejudice over principle, convenience over courage, racism over readiness. The men of the 555th never got their war, but they won something more important. They won the future.